Hello, hello. All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties here. Um, so, my name is Chris Burkard, and I'm here on behalf of Sony to chat with you about a couple different things. And what we're mostly going to be going over today is 4K video and my journey to kind of using the mirrorless cameras in some of these really harsh conditions. But to be honest, I just want to preface all this by saying that I could care less about technology. It's really the least interesting thing about photography to me. And I know that as we walk around the show, that's really what this is about, technology. We can see so much of that. But for me, if you can't marry technology with this idea of going places, if it can't actually bring you closer to an experience, if it can't actually take you somewhere, then what's the point of it? And so for me in my work, this has played such a huge, immense role, is actually using this technology, and that technology for me has been smaller, lighter camera systems, mirrorless, taking them further, deeper, and farther than I've ever thought I could go before. And I just kind of want to preface this by saying, the only reason I got into photography was because I wanted to travel. It was actually like the first thing that I ever got interested in, got me excited about, and what I ultimately wanted to kind of go and see was these places I had spent days and months, glaring at the pages of magazines, looking at when I was working at a magazine store at 19 years old. And I ultimately realized that that job, which I thought was going to get me closer to traveling to these places, all it did was actually made me lose my mind. And I quit that job, and I decided to pour everything I could into photography. And it was something that ultimately, made me realize the value of just, thrusting yourself into situations, especially the ones where you as a photographer are forced to immerse yourself, no pun intended, in the actual experience. That's really what my work has been about. That's what my thoughts and ideas of photography have really surrounded, by, is this idea that we can't be bystanders in our work. We have to actually be immersed in it. We have to actually be immersed in the experience, because ultimately we want to be storytellers, right? That's why we pick up cameras, to tell stories, not just through the photos, but with our voices and with our, social media and all these different forms of storytelling we have. So, where to start? Okay, so basically, I kind of, to preface this, and what I really want to get to is going to these crazy locations, using the cameras that I was, and why. But to get there, I need to talk to you a little bit about, like, my journey of actually, why do you travel to Russia? Why do you travel to Russia for surfing, for fly fishing? Why do you travel to Norway? Why do you go to Iceland 20 times? I don't know. You just do. It's something that becomes as much of a part of you as is anything else. You're kind of called to go there. But ultimately, it didn't start that way. Keep in mind, my career started on the sunny coast of California, and if that didn't seem nice enough, I had these dreams and visions of and ideas of me being a photographer shooting for magazines professionally, and that's ultimately what ended up happening. But there was just one problem. You see, when I quit my job at 19 and decided to pursue photography, it was I had no passport, and I had never traveled anywhere outside of the Western United States. So it took a lot of creativity, a lot of sleeping in my car, a lot of, I don't know, nickel and dime food to basically get to the point where I was traveling and doing this for a living. Ultimately, I was, traveling to these kind of storybook, exotic locations, shooting surfing in some of the most, amazing ferry book locations on the world. But I realized the more time I spent in those locations, shooting these beautiful beaches and stuff, it actually started to make me feel like I wasn't truly experiencing these places. I was this kid at the time who was going to these amazing places and only truly experiencing them when I would get home and look at the photographs. I was traveling through my camera, and I feel like, I say this phrase, and I think many of you know what I mean by traveling through your camera, meaning the whole entire trip you're like this. You're looking around, but you're not actually experiencing it for yourself. And when I was coming home, it was like, wow, that was an amazing trip. And I was kind of reliving it all at that point, months later. And what it was things like Wi-Fi, TV, fine dining, and that constant cell connection that were all the trappings of places heavily touristed in and out of the water. And for me, it was just too much. I realized that these weren't the places that I dreamed about. These weren't the wild, crazy destinations that I wanted to go and shoot work that felt remote and distant and brought people to that experience right away. So I started to kind of seek out the places. This is ultimately what I wanted to get away from, right? Was shooting at a place where millions and millions of people have shot before. So I started to seek out the places that were too cold, too remote, and too dangerous to photograph and surf for these editorial assignments, and that's what I did. I decided to seek these places out because of the risk and because of the challenge. And I think that the combination of both gave me something that I hadn't yet experienced in my career. Now, I'm going to show you this quick video of that experience and what it's like to go there and photograph these places and be there. But before I get to that, I just want to let you know that as I started to do that, as I started to make this change in my work of going to these places that were super remote, we started to have issues. We first ran into issues with access, safety, logistics. My specialty as a photographer is planning large-scale expedition-type trips, the types that take 3 years to plan. This is the Aleutian Islands, a really remote island in the Aleutian chain that stretches from Alaska to Russia, and we went there to surf for like 2.5 weeks, and it was a trip that just took years and years to plan. So this is the type of work that we were involving ourselves in. And keep in mind, when you're going to a place like this, your camera system is the last thing on your mind because you're worried about where you're going to sleep, what you're going to eat, safety, the safety of the people you're with, especially when you're in a place where it'll take days, potentially multiple days to get somebody actually to a hospital or to get a rescue or something like that. So it really makes you realize that everything you need has to pare down into some little tiny compartment, right? This photograph was taken in Iceland, by the way. So let me show this video really quick, and then I want to kind of discuss ultimately when I started migrating from being a dedicated Canon user to being a dedicated Nikon user, and even a staff pro for Nikon, to plunging everything I could into a very emerging system at the time. This is about 5-6 years ago, the Sony system. And at the time, from an editorial perspective, from my editors and my colleagues and people that shot in the same world, it was almost laughable. Like, you're taking this unproven camera system out into the field and thrusting yourself into these conditions that, you think it's going to be better because it's smaller and it's lighter and it has really amazing technology. Well, it's kind of scary, to be honest, but that's exactly what I did. And the first thing that I noticed was that I was coming back with these kind of quiet, simple moments that I never would have photographed before because I never would have had my camera. See, I never would have taken the energy or the time to pull out a camera when it was freezing or pissing rain. I didn't want to damage all this gear hanging off my body. My shoulders, my neck, my back was sore from carrying around, lugging around gear for weeks at a time in the Arctic. 25 days in the Arctic, shooting these assignments. The last thing I wanted to do is, at the end of the day, when I could jump into a hot tub, is to pull out my camera and take a photo. But ultimately, that's what I was doing, and the photographs that I was coming back with were being more well-received commercially and editorially. And let me just show this really quick, too. This is a short film from a trip to Norway that I helped produce, and the film is about me shooting in these conditions, and it won a lot of film festival awards. I've been able to direct and produce quite a few projects from Alaska and the Faroe Islands and Norway and some other places in between, and most of these were also shot on Sony. This was a mixture of, I think, FS700 and GoPro and a couple other things, but ultimately the small package we were able to bring on these trips is why we were able to create this type of content. So.
So cold out there?
Yeah, it's freezing, but absolutely pumping when the right one comes in. It's flawless with the offshore wind, or offshore snow, I should say.
Some of these places I go, they feel like a photographic purgatory. It just feels foreign. It's like, walking on the moon or something like that. When people think of surfing, the last thing people consider is, surfing in the Arctic. The contrast of going to these harsh, remote environments and having surfing be your means of exploration, it doesn't get any better than that. I feel almost driven to document the Arctic, and in a lot of ways, Arctic surfing. photography for me was a release. I wanted to immerse myself in the beauty of what I was seeing with my own eyes. And I felt like it became this kind of symbiotic relationship that really was the perfect medium of expression for me. As soon as I got a camera, I realized that this could be my vehicle to go experience the world. I love to travel. You know, like I'm a cold water fanatic. That's why I go to these cold, harsh environments. The clouds, the moodiness, the northern lights. It truly is beautiful and epic, and the surreal landscapes that come out of this North Atlantic Sea has really drawn me in.
This morning we had to shovel out the car for about an hour before we could even get out of the driveway. And we had about 5 to 6 feet of like snowdrift last night, and it's just packed beyond belief.
Being from Southern California, it's the complete opposite from what I'm used to.
It's just a different kind of beauty. It's real raw, and just getting to see this side of God's creation is super rad.
It truly is beautiful and epic and mystical, all while being some of the most harsh conditions I've ever seen. I have such a respect for the guys that get out there in the water. They really have the tough end of the deal.
I kind of feel like I'm going to war or something. Like I got my combat suit on.
You know, you're putting on 5 to 7 millimeters of rubber, and then you're hopping in water that's, 35 to 45, 46 degrees.
It doesn't really get much better for traveling to cold destinations. Surfing between these giant cliffs and good waves. It's the raddest thing ever.
When you're first paddling out, it's kind of a shock, and then within 2 minutes, you start feeling your core temp drop.
And you make one little turn the wrong way and your wetsuit gets flooded and it feels like electrifying.
The ocean, for years, has been considered by a lot of the locals in these places such a dangerous, scary place. And when you see, these professionals working in such an amazing way, riding storm surf with crazy undertows and huge currents and winds from some of the roughest seas in the world. But it all kind of comes together in this beautiful way when those storms do subside, and there's these glimpses in between, these harsh moments where you get perfection.
It humbles you and makes you realize how at the mercy of the ocean and the elements we are.
I know that the surfers are out in the water suffering just as much as I am, if not way more. So I feel like you have this extremely heavy task on your shoulders of making sure that you document what's going on accurately and appropriately and doing them justice, because you're only going to get so many moments.
Today's looking like a perfect day to get in the water, so I'm gonna jump in and see what I get. It's just a matter of trying to get everything warm before you go in.
When you want to get these images, when you want to get these moments, you have to be out in the elements, really experiencing it. And for me, I love to suffer. The idea of having cold fingers and, brittle skin and chapped lips and, really putting yourself out there in the elements. I guess that's when you feel like you're really paying the price, but the greatest rewards come.
Real deal right now, dude. This stuff's so slick.
I think the surf community is a passionate bunch. I mean, it's just such a beautiful way to interact and to share experiences with people. And I think that experience is what draws you all closer. It makes you feel like you're part of a group. We all want to see what's out there. We all want to push past that next headland and see if there's a better wave on the other side. And I think that experience is what draws you all closer. That community, I feel like it's like family. I think as photographers, our goal, or at least my goal, is always to inspire people. If you're not sharing your work, then what are you doing? I just want to stoke people's passions for adventure and getting out there. And I want people to drift away when they look at my images. I want them to feel like it's taking them so far from where they are at that moment that they're immersed in the feeling. I think that the adventure that comes from going to these places where you could easily go there and never get a single rideable wave, but what you do get when you get that, it's like the reward of bagging a new summit or like climbing to the top of like some unnamed peak. It's just, I don't know, there's a surreal victory that comes from that. And I feel like those are the ones that mean the most to me. Maybe not even the most beautiful images, but the ones where you come back and you're like, wow, I really gave something of myself to get that shot. I think that that's the beauty of going to those places, is learning new things about yourself every time you take a photograph.
So, okay. Thank you guys. They did a really great job on that. Actually, that whole thing was really cool. Why would anyone ever want to surf in freezing cold conditions? To be honest, I've thought about that a lot, and I know that it's not the most appealing thing to be in these harsh environments. But as a photographer, you're sometimes thrust into assignments and places where it's not the easiest place to shoot. Weather-wise, subject-wise, whatever it is. And what I found was that, for me, it was something that was drawing me closer to the experience. It was something where it was immense value going to places that nobody had gone to shoot. It doesn't matter what your subject is. Keep in mind, a lot of these trips that we're doing, our outlet and our goal is to create some cool editorial from it, something cool for the magazine, a feature, whatever. But there's a lot of commercial revenue being generated on this. A lot of these images were used by clients like Apple and Microsoft and Toyota, people that I regularly shoot for now. About 90% of my work is commercial photography, but this is really where it all started. And ultimately, the camera systems that I use today were all because of these trips that I started taking 4, 5, 6 years ago. Now, this trip was really a catalyst. It was a change for me because it was the first trip where I was completely 100% Sony dedicated user. And like I said prior, what I realized was there were these moments where in the past, when I had this big bulky body banging against my side all day, I would just want to put the thing away as soon as the conditions got really, really bad. As soon as it became a total whiteout blizzard or whatever, I would just put that camera away. It wasn't really worth me, thrashing a D800 or whatever it was. But since I was using this system, everything was lighter. I went from bringing a 600 millimeter f4, 300 millimeter 2.8, and a bunch of massive heavy lenses to paring down my system really, really immensely. And it was the first time where I could have a full frame camera, A99, an A7S or an A7, as well as a smaller NEX7, NEX6 body that could actually interchange all the lenses. And that was the biggest eye opener for me, was that if something happens, you don't have to have a backup body for every mount system. You could actually use this small, tiny, lightweight camera to shoot action with, because this is the challenge that I loved about shooting action sports. It was extremely demanding. You need fast autofocus systems. You need nice open lenses, fast lenses. You also need incredibly fast frame rates to capture action. But there were these moments in between that I found myself being able to shoot because I was willing to pull out a camera. I was, walking back to our cabin. Our vehicle got stuck in the snow, so we had to hike like 1.5 miles back to our cabin, and everything's packed in. I'm not really thinking there's going to be any great photographic moments, but I pulled out my camera, my fixed 35 that was hanging around my neck because it would fit inside my jacket, and I just snapped this frame, and it was one of the ones that I've sold a bunch and was used by Red Bull Illume as like the action sports photography competition winner for that year as well. And what I noticed is my work started to evolve, and I started to go further and into thrust myself into kind of some more remote places. And it was really this trip to Norway that was the catalyst for change, because I knew that a lot of this trip we were going to be traveling by snowmobile, 6-7 hours by snowmobile sometimes. And I knew that there was absolutely no chance I was going to be able to have a big camera bag with a pro-sized DSLR shoved in the side, pulling it out. I was going to be driving the thing most of the time, often driving it, pulling out the camera, firing off a couple frames. And you can't do that with a DSLR. You're not going to go like this because you can't see the viewfinder. So this was right when the A7 kind of came out. And I don't know if you are familiar with that camera, but it was one of Sony's first mirrorless ones. It was about this big. It could fit in your pocket with a pancake lens, or it could kind of fit, for us, we were wearing these survival suits, and you could put it right here in your chest with a kit lens, right? So what would happen was I'd be driving around the snowmobile, we'd be looking for waves or doing whatever, and just trying to get these kind of off-the-cuff moments as they would happen, and I'd be able to pull out this camera, look at the back screen, much like you would an iPhone, and it was this reactionary thing. All of a sudden, the photographs were just kind of a byproduct of the experience. I was pulling it up, firing off, and I'm not going to lie to you guys. The thing that I am the worst at is f-stops and apertures. I focus way more on composition and than anything else. So for me, this camera was really great, and there's a lot of shots where I would blow it, and the shutter would be too slow or whatever. But since I could just spin the dial with one thumb, with a glove on, and then fire away, and know that my exposure was at least somewhat well exposed, I could shoot these moments that before I was having to put up to my eye, fire a frame, maybe chimp, and I stopped chimping. I stopped doing that, and it was all of a sudden the camera was just something that was, like I said, it was there to kind of make the experience more real. So in addition to that, being able to start and just look further away, places that were more remote to get to. This is in Kamchatka, Russia. I traveled to Kamchatka, Russia for a fly fishing and surfing trip and film that we did about maybe 4 years ago. And this is another one of those places. The very first time I went to Russia, I made it into the country for about 4 hours. I made it into the country about 3 hours, and then I was thrown into a jail cell because I had passport issues. Now, that was in Vladivostok, maybe like in 2009 or something, and I just remember vividly needing to go back to Russia to redeem myself, to have a better experience. So on that trip, basically, I made it up to the customs agent. She looked at me, and she looked at my passport, and my visa had 1 day off of my correct entry date, even though we all applied at the same time, right? And I went to interrogation, then I went into a jail cell for 24 hours, and I got deported. And it was a really fun trip, but I was really defeated. And the one thing I knew is that when I go into that country again, I didn't want to look like a photographer with Pelican cases and bags and this and that. And I realized that I was making the experience harder than it needed to be. And there's a slim chance I might have gotten in there if I hadn't have just looked like I was there to kind of, document everything. So when I went to Kamchatka, it was a much different experience. I was using a really, really pared down system, a kit that was ultra minimalistic. I had 3 cameras. Each of them could be used with all the same lenses, A mount and E mount, because they had adapters. And it was a really good experience because I knew, and it was kind of this idea of the more you know, the less you need, right? So we were traveling by chopper and by 6-wheel Soviet troop carrier to a lot of these locations. And ultimately, like I said before, the first thing on your mind is safety, survival gear, all those other things that you're bringing, and lastly, camera gear. So I want to kind of go through just a couple quick images, specific images, and what they were shot with, why they were shot with that camera. Because for me, a big part of this process is, although technology is obviously, it plays an immense role in what we do, I find that the more you know your camera and what it can do for you, the better that outcome is going to be. And so a lot of times when I'm traveling to these places, so much goes into pre-planning. So the first trip, the Aleutian Islands. This is what you find when you land on this one particular island, Umnak. And this plane didn't crash. It actually it like had some engine problems at the end of the runway, and then the locals brought it back as some kind of like a welcome sign to the island, right? The natives are awesome there, all 12 of them, and they basically, it was one of these experiences where getting there was probably harder than actually being there. The experience, we traveled It took us 3 years planning, logistics, trying to actually secure how we could get to these little pinpoint of these, Google Earth pinpoints of beaches or reef that we had thought about getting to. And once we got there, every day we had to do about a 30-mile commute on quad, which would take about 2 hours or so. And every single thing we had for the entire day, rain or shine, hail, snow, whatever it was, there's no bears on this island. There was 11,000 head of reindeer and a bunch of other animals, but no bears, luckily, had to fit inside that little basket. So this was one of those trips where we were going to shoot a film. We had a bunch of commercial objectives as well we had to come back with. And so the camera gear was one of the least, probably, could really take up the least amount of space. You had to take an axe, a pump, a rope, everything you needed for your quad just to get out of there. And it was one of those places where you just, you kind of realize how remote, how far out you are. Now, the weather was probably the most detrimental thing on this island. You have to be prepared for the weather. So why was that a factor? Well, I've never been one of those people that wanted to carry a DSLR just hanging on my waist, banging into me the whole time. Some people have no problem with that. I'm not really that way. I knew that rain, shine came. I wanted to be able to protect my gear. So one of my favorite things, especially in cold conditions, is being able to have a big, thick down jacket and put your camera right inside. The A7 series, the A6000s, all of those smaller bodies usually can zip inside of a big puffy jacket. And so for me, keeping it warm, preserve battery life, as well as having an internal pocket where I would keep all my batteries close to my chest. That's something else you do usually to preserve your battery life. Having a pack of batteries that could fit into a small container was also extremely helpful for these cameras. It was kind of this, test of like learning what to go without, right? Because every day we would kind of have to decide how long are we going to be out in the field for and how much time do we need? Well, one of the biggest factors is charging cameras or gear. If we were going out overnight or not, that was really important. I'm not sure if many of you know, but the batteries, lithium-ion batteries that you're using inside some of those Sonys can actually be charged by a 2.4 amp USB, which means that basically any iPhone charger pretty much could charge your camera directly to the camera. So that was one of the biggest factors of being able to travel with light, portable mirrorless cameras, is that I didn't need 12 volt or bring a generator or to bring a larger battery pack to do that. I could charge it off a Goal Zero. It's a brand that makes really good kind of rugged portable energy. I could travel with a small Goal Zero, iPhone charger essentially that would work to charge my electronics too. So charging my gear in the field was immense help in that capacity as well. So this photograph was probably for me, I'm not sure if the color is exactly the same, the color rendition is the same as on the screen, but this photograph for me, it was one of the spreads in the magazine. It was licensed a bunch and stuff, but this is one of those moments where for an editorial photographer, the challenge of shooting surfing is what drew me to it. I guess I've always been kind of a masochist in that sense, that I've just liked the challenge, the hardship, enduring salt water. It's hard on your gear. It's cold. There's so many factors. It's not just showing up to a location hoping that your athlete or your subject can smile well. It's the wind. It's the tide. It's the swell. It's the weather. It's your athlete. And then ultimately, it's you. Okay? So one of the things that's hard is to kind of have these off-the-cuff moments where you can just ideally snap a photo. Usually you're set up, you have your big lens on the beach, and you're shooting, or you're in the water, swimming with somebody. But on this trip particularly, I had my Sony A99 full-frame translucent mirror camera with a 70-400 wrapped around my body, dangling off to the sides. It's before the A7 came out, it was the lightest full-frame camera on the market. And then on my chest, I just had my NEX6 or I forget which one, NEX6, I think, just strapped there with a pancake lens. And what happened was, I saw this moment happening. Alex is on the inside doing a big turn. Josh is on the outside paddling out. Pete has just walked down past these slippery rocks, and he just looks up for this 1 second to see what's going on. And everything kind of seems to be coming together. There's this perfect space in the middle of the photograph for the gutter, right? And I was like, this is it. This is the photograph that sums up the entire trip. We've gone thousands of miles from home, spent tons of our own money and other people's money to go there. And we want to come back with something that really tells people how wild, how real this place is. And for me, this is that moment. And what I realized was that I actually saw this moment. I wasn't traveling through my camera like I had been before. And I picked up my camera, and I prayed that the settings were right and the photo wasn't blurry, and I just looked at the back of the screen for a split second, scrolled the wheel so that the exposure would be right, and I clicked the photo, and I clicked that one shot, and then he looked back down at his feet because he was probably going to slip off the rocks and walked into the water. And I knew that there was something special about that because I had lived that moment. Now, I want to, not to get too like camera theory here, but there's something to be said for the less space you create between you and your subject. And I physically mean like actual space. The larger of an object you have between you and your portrait subject, your landscape, whoever it is, the more intimate it's going to be, the less you have between you. So for me, this experience was so raw, it was so real. As a photographer and as a storyteller, it's something that I always remembered, and it was really helpful to be able to have these moments where I wasn't able to look down and chimp, make sure I got the shot. I knew what the shot looked like. And a couple seconds later, this is the photograph that I took with my other camera that was dangling off to my side. I pulled it up and I shot it about 100 millimeter. And one of the coolest things I loved about the A99 camera was I could put it into crop sensor mode. And crop sensor mode basically means I took it from full frame to APS-C. And by doing that, why would I do that? Why would anyone ever want to do that? Well, I did that because I knew that I needed to shoot fast action. I needed to shoot a high shutter speed. And I also wanted to shoot a low f-stop. But I didn't want to sacrifice my depth of field. By putting it into a APS-C mode, it gave me a greater depth of field because that's exactly what APS-C mode does. So the volcano, the mountains, the surfer, virtually almost all in focus. No, it's not photoshopped. I've gotten that question a lot of times. It's actually one of my favorite images, and the image that was on the cover of Surfer magazine. It was also used by Apple in the keynote. It was used by a ton of other commercial clients as well. But I took that choice because I knew what my technology could do. I understood the technology. It was something that I intimately understood and wanted to create an image like this. One of my favorite parts about this, you can't really tell here, but there's like a herd of reindeer on this cliff right here. It's really cool. Just a side note. So in terms of, summing up the trip, I don't know if you can see it. That's Alex down there. Every trip comes with their beatings. This is a good representation of what it's like to have safety as your first role. So it's great to be able to come back with photos. It's great to be able to come back with images. But, why wouldn't I have just brought, an APS, the A77, an APS-C camera, and the A99, and this and that? Well, because of this. Because of the fact that there are moments that are uncontrollable where we are out in the ocean in a very, very dangerous place where we have to decide, okay, in my little tiny, tiny shelf of a pack that I can bring, what do I need to have? Do I need to have emergency medical equipment, or am I going to bring an extra camera body? I'm going to bring emergency medical equipment because if something happened, it would basically be our job to go out and get him and bring him back in and this and that. So every decision we're making is a group decision. Every place and every kind of time we go out in the water, you're taking risks, calculated risks, obviously. And it's the same thing with cameras, right? You're always taking a calculated risk. By the way, you guys, any questions, you're welcome just to ask them while we're here, because I know at the end sometimes we pass over things. So feel free to ask, did anybody get frostbite? What kind of wetsuit did you wear? Blah, blah, blah. Totally doesn't matter to me. One thing, too, one of the reasons I really liked using smaller mirrorless cameras is because they all ran off SD cards. CF cards I had tons of problems with over the years. You'd break pins, things would happen. I can't tell you how many times they would get wet and stop working. So SD cards are shockproof, freeze-proof, waterproof, right? And that was something that was really, really valuable for me as well. Norway. This was one of the first experiences shooting the Northern Lights. And this was shot with the Sony A7. And I was extremely skeptical using this camera. I was extremely skeptical the first time I used this camera because this was probably the first experience I had using a small, tiny, lightweight camera. And this night was kind of that first moment where I was like, wow, I'm glad I brought this. It had just snowed, fresh batch of snow all over the rocks. I mean, I'm like 3.5 feet from the ocean right here, and you can see snow by the ocean doesn't last that long. So basically woke up, walked, hiked from our car was completely snowed in, hiked from our cabin about 2 miles back to the beach with this tiny setup. And I took I took a series of Northern Lights images with this camera, and I was really worried, because I was shooting on a, APS-C sensor and, longer exposure. I was like, I'm going to have a lot of noise. I'm going to have a lot of color degradation and chromatic aberration. It's just going to look really bad. But I was using the Zeiss lens 24 f1.8, and this was kind of the first experience using some of that glass, and I was so impressed by the quality of it. And it was one of the things that kind of became a staple for me. This image as well. This is another photograph that I decided to shoot APS-C mode. Now, I shot this with the NEX7 with an LE-A4 adapter and an A-mount 70-200. If you guys can follow me, basically, the A-mount is the larger camera, translucent mirror, kind of DSLR-esque mount system. And this is before they had the lens options they have now. This is about 5-6 years ago. So I shot that lens with an adapter that allowed me to shoot it on this small, tiny body. My entire kit was like this big. It was really small. And I had a camera that could have gone on there easily, but this day was pissing rain, snowing, everything. This was the first time we saw the sun in about 3 weeks. I had been in Norway for 20-something days, and we only saw the sun this one day. And what I realized was in March, if you're in a fjord, don't expect to see the sun because it doesn't happen. The sun just kind of travels along the horizon and peaks out at the very end of the day. So we got lucky to see anything. But it came out, and it was this finite experience, this very, very quick moment. And I knew that I wanted this depth of field. I wanted to get that hill, that mountain that was all caked in snow and the surfer in this shot. In order to get everything in focus, I needed that APS-C sensor technology. And so this is what I did. I purposefully used this. And the beauty of it is that I knew I had 10 frames a second I could shoot. And at the time, and still to this day, the A6000, which is the current model after the NEX7, is the fastest APS-C camera on the market for its size, hands down. And it is something that I would never leave anywhere without, because when you're shooting action and when you need to be able to grab these moments, this can be the difference between getting the cover or not, right? Is that one of those 10 frames. And believe me, I shot like 34 of this, because ultimately, when you're shooting action sports, you need to shoot the entire thing in case the magazine wants the whole sequence or in case somebody wants that. And this is the moment I'm pulling out, yes, but there's money to go along with that. This photo kind of speaks for itself. Not the type of image you usually expect to have your gear out in, right? But an image that's really easy to capture if you're sliding a camera out of your chest pocket and just firing off a frame. This was in Norway, coming back from shooting. You can see the wave in the background, and you have no idea what the conditions are doing, how they're changing, or what's kind of happening with them. So Iceland. Iceland's a place that has been really significant to me as well, and this is one of those locations that I've traveled to. It's probably on everybody's bucket list here. I hope so. It's kind of a must-go at some point in your career or life. And I've been there 20 times. I've shot everything from Justin Bieber's album photos there to Super Bowl commercials to everything in between. I don't even know why, but for some reason it's a place that I've been drawn to and I've been able to do a lot of work. But what drew me there originally was the ruggedness and the remoteness, and I wanted to bring something different to the viewer than they had seen. So some of the first surf trips to Iceland ever were some ones that we did. And this was on one of those experiences. And ultimately, getting out of the car, I didn't want to have some massive camera bag. I just popped out and I pulled out my Zeiss 24 Prime and my NEX, or I think it was the A7, and I fired off this frame. And it was ultimately one of those photos too that was kind of a marquee image from the trip. It really summed up the experience, and it wasn't really the opportunity where I had time to tell people to look up or hey, acknowledge, or look over here, or do this and that. It was just this was what happened as it was happening. I don't know why I included this photo. I just really liked it. So, game-changing images for me. Another one. I think the main reason I show a lot of these images too is because of the technical challenge of actually shooting them. Okay, so let me explain something here. When you see the surfer right there, that dark object, before he was in the air, he was at the bottom of the wave. He was in the dark spot. It is extremely challenging to focus on a subject when they're in a dark place. When he's there, it's really easy because it's a high contrast scenario. It's really easy, right? But before he was there, he had to basically make his arc from the bottom of the wave and catching air. So basically, I had to be focusing on him the entire time in order to shoot this frame. This was shot with the AX7 and a kit lens, actually, of all things. This was one of those times when I never really expected to get an image or a photograph, but it happened and it occurred, and I felt like the key factors here are that I had 12 stops to dynamic range. The newer cameras, the A7s, have about 14 stops. And with that dynamic range, I could pull so much detail out of the sky. I could preserve the highlights. I could bring back the shadows if I wanted to. And that's one of the things that's been really helpful for me is I shoot in harsh conditions. I go to places where we don't expect to see the sun. And when we do, you have to just shoot. You can't always wait for perfect light. And a lot of times on commercial assignments, whether I've been shooting for automobiles or whomever, you have to deal with that. That's what you're forced to deal with. So by bringing a camera that can ultimately, in post, you can work with the image. You can help manipulate a lot of those details so that you can bring back highlights, preserve details. That's been really important to me. So this sensor was one of my favorites. This was actually with the NEX6, which had a slightly better autofocus system than the NEX7. And this image was one of my favorites because I shot it with a lens that had such bad reviews and had such a kind of never really got its credit. I think it was like the 16 to 70 or something like that. I forget, but it was just a lens that I never really expected, and I happened to be there, and I ultimately lived that saying that the best camera truly is the one you have with you. And I'm going to add a line to that. It's also the one you're willing to pull out, because I'm not going to lie that there are times in my career when I felt extremely lazy. I've had a camera, it's been right next to me, and I haven't pulled it out of my backpack because it would require me to put my bag down in the rain and pull out the thing out of the back and, and do all that. And you know what? That's a bummer. That's sad that we've become kind of so accustomed to that. So for me, being able to unzip my jacket, pull out a lens or a camera and fire off a frame has been a revolutionary experience. It's been freeing, actually. Kamchatka, again. This is another photograph of that trip and that experience. One of those things too, a lot of these places that we've gone, we were surfing on mostly Russian military bases. In Russia, almost all their military bases are on the coast because they use a lot of submarines for the military. So and that's typically where the waves are the best, right? A submarine canyon creates a really good little spot for swell to come in and create surf. So it was kind of this cat and mouse game with the military, trying to get access, sometimes not getting access, but still going there anyway, and just trying to play it dumb or whatever. And what I found was you're so much less threatening when you have a smaller system and a smaller setup. If I'm posted up on the beach with my big, Arca Swiss plate and I've got everything going on and I'm my 600, it looks a little threatening. And but what I found is when I have a camera that I don't need a tripod, that has internal stabilization, Sony A7 II, where I can basically hold the thing up with my hand and shoot images and shoot action, that was a really big game changer for me. Now, I want to show you guys, I don't even know how much actual time I have here, but this is also, by the way, Kamchatka, if there's any fly fishermen out there, Kamchatka is basically like the Shangri-La of fly fishing. It's one of the best places on the entire planet, and I've never seen anything like it in my life, just salmon and everything running up the rivers. So that was a really cool experience as well. A lot of these photographs I would take, I come from a surf background, so I've used housings almost my entire career, water housings, every type you can imagine, aluminum, injection molded epoxy. But the beauty is when I started to use these smaller cameras, I realized that I didn't need these big, bulky housings that needed an entire Pelican case. I could actually put my cameras into a small bag. There's one from a company called EWA Marine. They make these really, really good industrial bags that are pretty flexible, and they pancake down to nothing. And I've actually been able to shoot surfing as well as a lot of fly fishing and stuff where I had to cross the river to get there, which is really kind of a game-changing experience. Now, there's this one last trip before I get into, I want to just discuss really quick some 4K video thoughts too. This is probably one of my favorite images from Kamchatka. These are just these amazing cloud formations over the volcano. And that was our little Russian-Soviet vehicle right there. So there was a lot of access plays a big role in my work. As you can tell, it's always like half the battle is getting there. And once you're there, shooting everything else. Kind of just, you don't really think about that until you're there usually. But there have been a few times where it's really, kind of made or break. It's really been a make or break situation. One of them is in Alaska. I've been to Alaska about 5 times, and I love the place. This was a trip I did to a boat trip on a crab fishing boat outside of the Kenai Peninsula. And the Kenai Peninsula is down by Homer. It's this beautiful stretch of land, really hard to access. It's basically between Seward and Homer. And we went by crab fishing boat to this kind of remote beach, and that was the assignment, was to go and shoot this stuff for a myriad of different editorial outlets and magazines and editors and everything. So we get there, and the boat pulls about a half mile offshore, and the captain looks at us. He's like, "There you guys go. There's the beach." And we're like, "Awesome. Where's the harbor?" And he's like, "There's no harbor." He's like, "You got to make it to shore." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And so we had the very, very fun experience being parked like a mile offshore, jumping on paddle boards with $80,000 worth of equipment strapped to my back. And that sounds like a lot of weight, but the beauty is, since everything was mirrorless, everything was smaller, we weren't really actually taking that much weight. It was just the expense of the gear that was a lot. Video cameras, film cameras, to make a film and a project on this beach. So for me, strapping that to my back, punching through the shore break on a surfboard in a dry bag, it's an interesting experience. And the worst part is actually coming back. And on the way back, this is a story for another time, but I remember on the way back after a couple days on this beach, it was low tide, and at low tide, the waves are much more dumpy, right? So I'm trying to get back to the boat, just fighting the current, paddling back. I got this heavy backpack. It's so tightly strapped to my chest that I'm like, if I fall off this board, I'm going to drown. It's basically what's going to happen. And I get past the shore break, 40 minutes fighting through this shore break. And I'm like maybe like a third of the way out to the boat, and I just see this massive black fin between me and the boat, and it was a killer whale. And that wasn't a fun experience. I made it back to the boat. Everything's good. But yeah, that was one of those ones where I'm like, oh my gosh. So ultimately, access is such a huge thing. And when your camera gear and your technology doesn't inhibit that access, it makes life so much different, at least for me. Now, personal projects, you guys, I want to talk to you a bit about these as well. I know a lot of this has really been focusing on this kind of adventure, sports-related kind of surfing and all that type of stuff. But about 90% of my work is commercial. And like I said before, I shoot a lot for brands like Toyota and Microsoft and Apple and yada, yada, yada. And what I found is that beyond that, it's always so important to be involved in a personal project. And for me, that's been these Icelandic braided rivers. Now, what you're looking at here is basically the very highest peak of a floral and fauna bloom mixed with glacial sediment in a riverbed. We're about 4,000 feet in the air looking down from a Cessna on a river called the Trugna River in Iceland's Highland region. I've been shooting aerial photography for about 4 or 5 years now, and I love the perspective it gives. And as, like with anything, it's really funny because I love doing something new, something different, challenging. It kind of opens you up to having to shoot a different way, forcing you to look at your equipment a different way. And so one of the things for me is shooting out of a Cessna, or shooting aerial photography in general, it's not cheap. It's really expensive unless you are able to go with a pilot that you know or fly out of a plane. Helicopters are not cheap. Really, really not cheap. So for me, I've been trying to shoot more out of a plane, but when you shoot out of a plane, you're going to experience heavy, heavy wind vibration. It's really intense. Anytime you stick your hand out that plane or camera, you'll notice that wobble, that shake, right? Enter the A7 II, the predecessor to the A7R II. It had a stabilized sensor, which is one of the first cameras that I was able to really effectively shoot out of a Cessna successfully. This photograph is one of my favorites. This gives you a little more context. This is the ocean right up here, okay? This is a beach, and this is basically, see these yellows? This is what's going into the river here and feeding into this part. Now this over here, these like, I'm colorblind by the way, so these are like greens or blues, whatever. This is feeding in from the glacier, and these colors are meeting, right? And for me, it's just this beautiful marriage of color and light and all this stuff happening. And I've been so drawn to document these rivers. It's something that I've really been in love with, and it's a unique thing because ultimately anything that you really are passionate about, you want to bring, the best you can, the best work you can. And so for me, it's been kind of an eye-opening experience. I've learned that shooting with a polarizer almost always and every time you go up there is really important. It cuts the reflection out of the rivers. It really brings richer, deeper greens. One thing you notice too about polarization that people kind of often forget is that even on cloudy days, even a place that it rains a lot, you're still going to get reflection out of the grasses, out of the trees, out of the leaves, and that polarizer cuts that reflection, so it really helps to bring out a richer, deeper hue of whatever color you're looking at. This is basically a photograph looking towards the inland of the country from the coast, and what you see is all these kind of mineral pools. This is a big river that's flowing from the glacier in the background, right? And just to come back to the idea that none of this for me was really possible, at least successfully, until I started using a camera that had a stabilized image sensor. It has, I think the A7 II had a five tiny axis where it would stabilize the sensor. So when I'm looking down and you're pointing down, you're really able to capture an image that doesn't have motion blur, because you can have a 2,000th of a second exposure and everything can be great, but you'll still get blur on the corner. And what it is, it's from wind kind of hitting that glass. So I want to, this is also, I'm not sure if you've noticed, this is a mountain from the movie Noah. It was like where they kind of filmed a lot of the scene. It's this amazing green mountain. And it only blooms green for like 1 month a year. And the month kind of depends on how much snow they had. But this year, I shot this maybe just, a lot of this work too is really current. So I shot this maybe like 2 months ago or so. And it was the only month where it wasn't covered in snow and it finally bloomed. But it's such an amazing sight to see and experience that. So I want to show just 2 more quick videos and talk about 4K video really fast. I know I'm kind of running out of time. So 4K video. And the Sony Action Cam, actually, in general. The Sony Action Cam, I wish I had one with me, but it's basically like this big. And the newest rendition of it is 4K. And I've been able to use that pretty early from Sony and test it out and use and put it on some trips and stuff. And I think for me, one of the most unique things is everything that we do, or myself, my production company, the people that I travel with, we're always trying to bring the lightest weight and most efficient approach to. And so one of the coolest things that I've found is that being able to have a camera that you could essentially strap onto any athlete, any person with a talent or a skill or someone, and let them do the filming for you. It's amazing. It adds this intimacy, this POV, and that's ultimately what these types of POV cameras are meant for, right? They're meant for that first-person perspective, ultimately. And this is where I think people start to kind of not understand so much what they're used for. I think one of the hardest, the questions I get a lot is, okay, when do I pick up my GoPro and when do I put my DSLR down, or vice versa? Well, I'll tell you when. This was shot in Havasupai Indian Reservation. Havasupai Indian Reservation is home to Havasupai Falls, which is some of the most beautiful waterfalls, like 7 or 8 waterfalls in Arizona. You have to hike 10 miles in. 10 miles. Food, clothing, camp gear, everything. We're talking, and it's, by the way, it's like 105 degrees when you're hiking in. This was in like last spring. So, like I said, the last thing we brought in was our camera gear. I brought in 1 camera, 1 lens, and like 3 action cams. And the action cams were all this big. And they could all charge off of small solar, actually iPhone little batteries from Goal Zero. So that was really nice. I hiked up this waterfall because I was going to jump off next, right? So there's no other way to hike up, hike down. It's pouring water everywhere. It's super mossy and slippery. I'm hiking up with the thing in my mouth. And I go up because I wanted to get this point of view perspective. It was something that I knew I couldn't shoot with a DSLR, okay? I would have been constantly wiping water off the lens, right? I would have been just fighting it the whole time. I probably would have drowned the thing, even if it was in a housing. So I hiked up, I shot this photo, I jumped off. Again, another photograph shot with that camera. 10 frames a second, bursts. Another photograph, POV, shot with that camera. And this is actually the older rendition of the camera. The newer rendition has actually a better image quality. And what I found was for me, what I've learned from shooting these small POV cameras, that when you're shooting those, you're almost always partaking of the experience. Because the camera is so small, it's so tiny, it's in your pocket, you're pulling it out, and then you're just firing off a frame. You know, this is the actual place that you can camp. It's a campsite. A very dangerous one, but it's a campsite. And so at every point, you're almost always just there kind of firing off this photo, you know? And what you find is you start to see these moments that are really interesting that I wouldn't have normally seen if I was hunting around with my DSLR, with my camera smashed up to my face, right? I wouldn't have found these moments because I wasn't really living the experience as much. Now, I just want to show you these 2 quick videos really fast. And like I said, too, if you guys have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to ask.
On the road, the unknowns draw us forward, a voice calling us to what lies ahead. These are the moments to remember, enjoy, and share.
What we got over here? Some avo and bread. That's all you need. Holy moly.
Thanks for bearing with me here. So I think just in summation, you know, I'm going to be off to the side if anybody has any questions. I'm going to play this last little thing and let it run out. But I just wanted to say, I think that it's super important as photographers, as storytellers, that we choose and pick equipment wisely that's ultimately there to bring us closer to the action, but not just that, to the experience. I found that for me, when I stopped traveling through my camera and started just traveling and having the camera be a kind of an accessory to that travel, it really helped me to open up as a storyteller, as somebody who could share basically the experiences, emotionally, personally, whatever that was, through my images. And it really actually helped on a lot of different realms, editorially, commercially, and for social media as well. And so I just want to thank you guys for your time. I'm going to play this last little video from Havasupai, and if anybody has any questions, I will be right off to the side here. Thank you so much, you guys. If you have any questions about the cameras or what was shot where, or how to get somewhere, or what it's like to get frostbite, I'm over here. Feel free to ask away.